The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning these witnesses. Because of Cuba's, let me strike that. Because of the U.S.'s unilateral embargo, we sometimes assume Cuba's economy is cut off from the world. That certainly has not been the case, from my understanding. Investors from all over the world operate joint ventures in Cuba. Countries like Venezuela, Brazil, China, Vietnam extend credit to Cuba. Indeed, a Spanish company is leading an effort to drill for oil in Cuba's territorial waters this year, if I am not mistaken. And I believe that American companies should be afforded the same investment opportunities in Cuba. Let me ask both of the witnesses, what do you foresee happening if the U.S. normalizes its trade relations with Cuba? Can you indicate what markets would be ripe for entry in the U.S., for the U.S.? What markets are there that American companies might be able to penetrate most readily and most thoroughly if, in fact, we would normalize trade relationships? Mr. Bastian, would you please begin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you might imagine, we don't have an awful lot of information on the specific needs of Cuba insofar as business is concerned. We don't share information with our trading partners, other trading partners, principally because we don't trade with Cuba to begin with. But I think it's a pretty safe assumption to say that in the areas of infrastructure, I think we've already covered, as an example, briefly telecommunications, but I think if you took a look at general infrastructure, about transportation equipment, port handling equipment, things of that nature, ports, railroads, airports, things of that nature, I think would offer some significant, probably opportunity to U.S. business, certainly things that we would be taking a look at. But, and keep in mind also that at the moment we do have we're the 5th largest supplier to Cuba of product, not manufactured goods necessarily, except maybe some in the medical field, but basically agricultural goods. But I think if we took a look initially at those sectors, how do you move goods across the island to reach the Cuban people, I think those would be essentials to look at.
In addition to what Mr. Bastian said, I think based on the data available to us, some of the other areas that would have some potential would be food processing, handling, distribution, and as he said, in the medical area. Last year we licensed about 47 individual transactions for medical sales to Cuba, worth about $64 million. So I think that would be another area.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an estimate for the lost business opportunities that have occurred as a result of the embargo? How many business opportunities has U.S. companies lost as a result of the embargo? You got an estimate? Or?
Mr. Chairman, I think the really short answer is no, we don't. Okay. Again, we clearly are not approached by U.S. companies that are, say, I could have sold so much to Cuba. That we have not gotten. So I think you could probably take a look at maybe, there was a really old study done, I think, by the ITC back around, I think, 2001 in that time frame there, but the data, of course, is, in that case, is 8 years old, so, but it might give you an indication. But beyond that, I'm not aware of any information that's out there that talks about sales foregone.
Okay. Mr. Borman?
I don't have any other information on that, Mr. Chairman.
All right. If the embargo were lifted, what do you believe will be the impact in Cuba? Will the Cuban people see a difference in their daily lives if the Cuban government still controls the distribution of goods? And secondly, how can we be assured that the Cuban government will grant the appropriate licenses and other authorizations to American companies to do business? Do you have any information? Can you help us along with an answer to those questions? Mr. Bastian?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speculation is very difficult and sometimes pretty dangerous thing to get into. But I think you did mention something that's absolutely key, and that is this is a two-way street. The President, as an example, has announced some measures, is interested in pursuing those, and what we need to do is to find basically a partner for that dance that will show a willingness to continue this course of action. I think that would probably be my response.
The only thing I would add to that is obviously a lot of the impact would be dependent upon the funds available to the Cuban people to actually purchase U.S. goods on a commercial basis, and so that's a big unknown at this point.
Okay, my time is up, and now I will yield for the purposes of questioning 5 minutes to the ranking member. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, welcome to the subcommittee. Mr. Bastian, I was noticed in your testimony on the amount of agricultural exports that occurred in trade between the U.S. and Cuba in 2008 was $700 million. Can you give me an idea of how much that might that amount might be due to an increase in commodity prices? As you'll recall, last year some of those export prices were rather high.
I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. I'll get it for you, but I think that you're absolutely right, because it was a significant jump in dollar amount over the last couple of years, due in large measure to commodity prices.
If there were a way to get the information to the committee to measure increase in exports in
real terms,
something other than dollars.
Okay, I understand, sir. Yeah. We'll get that back to you.
All right, thank you. Also, the Castro regime confiscated many businesses and took intellectual property such as trademarks when they took over power, and claimed that they now own those properties. How does the U.S. address trade policy with countries that don't honor property rights?
Okay, I do believe that that's a question that really does need to be directed to the State Department on that. But if I might, you do bring in an interesting point, which is lifting the restrictions on Cuba on trade is part of what needs to be done. I think the other part of the things that you referred to, I think you mentioned in the beginning, your interest in non-tariff barriers, and I think there's a whole host of issues that we would need to take a look at there if we're going to get the maximum benefit for U.S. companies.
Perhaps you can ask this. I would like to ask that. How should we deal with Cuba regarding our company's intellectual property, given the profits Cuba has made selling confiscated property of former Cuban companies, usually in the form of rum or cigars?
I think we'd have to take a real hard look at that. And these are some of the issues, among others, that we would have to take a look at and get resolution to, I think, before we can move forward. It also brings up the whole question of, you're talking about intellectual property, about the security for potential future investors in the island. There are a host of issues we need to take a look at, the ones that you deal with.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bastian. Mr. Borman, the BIS is working on a regulatory change to implement the directive to permit license exemptions for donations of personal communications devices to Cuban citizens, but not to the Cuban government. How can we ensure that the donations are not confiscated or redirected to the government? Well,
that really will depend on the knowledge people have of the individuals getting it, and then various ways of feedback we have. We don't have a way to go in and necessarily check on individual items once they're there, but there are a variety of other information sources we have that will help us assess that.
Okay. Have you defined what a personal communications device is?
Yes, it's something that's really in retail sale. So, as I mentioned, it's things like personal digital assistants, mobile phones, satellite phones, laptop, desktop computers, digital cameras. Mm-hmm. Certainly nothing above a personal consumer level, nothing that businesses or governments would really use in any significant way.
Okay. About 1/3 of license applications that you received in 2008 were returned without action. Why were the applications returned?
For one of two reasons. In some cases, licenses were not actually needed. There is a narrow strata of items like agricultural exports where you don't need an individual license. And the other group would be ones that there's simply not enough information on. So, for example, the license application, there's just not enough information on the proposed end user in Cuba for the U.S. government to make an informed decision. And so we return that saying, essentially, you can't ship unless you come in and give us more information.
Got it. All right. Mr. Bastian, one last question. As long as the embargo is the official U.S. policy, where do the companies that are permitted to export agricultural and medical products receive export assistance?
They don't. We're talking about sales of agricultural commodities, which is basically cash in advance from Cuba.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll yield back
Yes, sir.
to balance my time.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll allow you 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the U.S. Embargo is the most restrictive trade embargo on Cuba in the world, right?
Well, we do have fairly restrictive trade policies in some other countries, Iran, Syria, North Korea.
No, but I mean, there's no other country in terms of imposing an embargo against Cuba that comes near to
compared
what
to other
ours
countries.
is. Right. What is the next most restrictive trade policy imposed on Cuba by another country that you would? Is there any?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not aware of what other countries' policies are.
We've talked about this distinction between the government and the people and steps that can be taken to try to ease some of the, or promote more interaction with the people of Cuba as opposed to with the government, which is tricky. It's tricky when we try to make that distinction in a lot of places, and I can think of a number of other examples, but are there, and some of this has to do with just allowing dollars and resources to flow straight to residents of Cuba. But is there any kind of NGO infrastructure or other ways of getting resources to the people as opposed to the government? And after you comment on that, could you describe the impediments that the government might present to having that happen?
Well, certainly on the NGO side, there are some NGOs that have a fairly well-established track record of operating within Cuba. And in fact, particularly on the medical side, the medical donations we authorize are really through those organizations. And I suppose there's always a possibility that the government will decide to do things differently. But I think there's enough information flow in and out of Cuba that it'll be fairly apparent if the government decides to do things in a more restrictive way than they're currently doing in terms of letting those NGOs receive things from donors in the U.S. and distribute them directly to the people.
Are there restrictions on the NGO activity that you know of now that exist that would, where if they ease those, that would be a kind of leading indicator that the government is dealing in a different way with that kind of humanitarian assistance and other assistance?
I don't have an answer to, but we can check on that and get back to you on that.
Okay, I appreciate that. And the steps that the President took or asked people to take just recently in terms of lifting certain restrictions. Are any of those ones that had been eased in the past and then tightened again, or would you view them all as new in either kind or degree?
On the gift parcels and the baggage, those were effectively changes to tightenings that were made in the previous administration. The donations of consumer communications devices, that's a new license exception.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back my time.
The chair thanks the gentleman. Now the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrich, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. You know, we're going to hear from the second panel in a few minutes, and I was just reading the testimony from the United States Chamber of Commerce, and a statement is made in their conclusion regarding the embargo that's gone on for the past 50 years. Instead of isolating Cuba from the rest of the world, it has isolated the United States from our allies. The Cuban dictatorship could never have withstood 5 decades of free trade, free markets, and free enterprise. That's a conjecture and stated pretty strongly. I also want, Mr. Chairman, to read a recent, or from a recent press release that the Diaz-Balart brothers, Lincoln and Mario, who represent Cuban-American community mainly in and around Miami, and they were talking about something that President Obama said during his inaugural address on January 20th, and let me quote from President Obama: "To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history, but that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench the fist." And that ends the quote. United States policy of state says the liberation of all political prisoners, the legalization of all political parties, independent labor unions and the press, and the scheduling of free, internationally supervised elections is what we treasure in United States law in regard to dealing with a country like Cuba. Let me ask Mr. Bastian first. The Castro regime confiscated many businesses and their intellectual property, such as trademarks, when they took over power and claimed they now own those properties. Now, for those who would say, well, we're trading with China, and this is a communist regime, I don't know that China has ever taken over or confiscated any American property, U.S. property, and done what Cuba did shortly after the Castros took over. How does the United States address trade policy with countries that do not honor property rights? How should we deal with Cuba regarding our company's intellectual property, given the profits Cuba has made selling confiscated property of former Cuban companies? Mr. Bastian.
Thank you, Congressman. I think this is something I tried to refer to earlier, and these are some of the issues that we absolutely need to get resolved, and we are familiar with the issues or the specific examples I think that you are alluding to. So these are the types of issues. I think this is what makes it's quite a step. It's a long step from saying, okay, well, we're going to do this, we're going to establish these commercial relations with Cuba, make it reciprocal, and then clean up a lot of these issues that we have to deal with, and a lot of pressure to do that.
Well, obviously it is complicated, and let me just quickly ask Mr. Borman. BIS is working on a regulatory change to implement the directive to permit license exceptions for donations of personal communication devices to Cuban citizens, but not to the Cuban government. How do we ensure that those donations are not confiscated or redirected to the government? What items fall under the personal communication device definition?
Well, again, because these will be donated often by relatives, I think it'll become very quickly apparent if the Cuban government changes its current policy and starts confiscating these types of things from individuals. And we have the flexibility in our regulatory scheme to change that if it turned out that was the case.
Sure. Well, I'm about to run out of my time, Mr. Chairman, but I would just say I agree with President Obama and the statement that he made at his inauguration. We need to see an unclenched fist, and I don't know that we're seeing that. And this business of saying, well, we're the only country, all the other Western Hemispheric countries are trading and getting this economic advantage by trading with Cuba. That's trying to say, well, the end justifies the means, and I think we've got a matter of principle here, and I do agree with the DI's Ballard brothers and Ileana Ross Layton and others who represent Cuban Americans who have suffered, and their families are continued suffering under this brutal communist dictatorship 90 miles from our shore. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair, thanks to the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes for questioning of the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for holding this very timely hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for appearing today. I represent the Tampa Bay area in Florida. My hometown of Tampa has extensive historic, family, and economic ties to Cuba. Prior to the revolution, there was very robust trade and travel. There were ferries that ran from the port of Tampa to Cuba. Cattle shipments left the port of Tampa, and many other agricultural products. So the Tampa Bay area has a great interest in modernizing the relationship. And President Obama's announcement was greeted with great enthusiasm by Cuban American families in my hometown and across the state. Travel agents now are absolutely overwhelmed. They don't know, they can't keep up with the requests from family members to travel. And the bureaucratic barrier that was previously in place was really a shame. My office deals with the family travel requests on a routine basis, and the stories of dying grandparents where family members now would like to go see them. I had one case of a bone marrow transplant. The sister was in the United States. The brother was there. She was the only match, and she had to go through all these bureaucratic hurdles to get there. But there's another bureaucratic hurdle in place now, and I hope that you all can help. Currently, there are only 3 airports in the United States that are permitted to service charter flights or any air flight, any air travel: Miami, New York, and L.A. Meanwhile, Central Florida probably has the highest population of Cuban Americans outside Miami, and we have requested the Treasury and Commerce to help us quickly with getting another airport, Tampa International or some of the others, approved on an expeditious basis. Can you help? I know this is an OFAC issue, but it seems to be directly consistent with President Obama's direction. The problem is that these families really shouldn't be subjected to a longer waiting period or additional cost having to travel to Miami just to get to the island.
We are in receipt of your letter to Secretary Locke, and after looking at it, it's become apparent to us that it's really the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection Unit, that has the principal responsibility. So we have already reached out to them and made them aware.
That's very interesting because we've talked to the Department of Homeland Security, and they said, no, this is Treasury. And they can't, this is people hate this about government. Right. Passing the buck. Where do we need to go to get this taken care of? I'm asking for your help as these families wait in line to try to see their family members.
As I said, in looking at the response that we would develop to the letter, it's become clear to us that it's DHS, but we'll take the responsibility of making sure the right agency comes back to you with that question and deals with that issue.
Because don't you agree this is consistent with President Obama's direction, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to just have L.A., New York, and Miami, when we have other cities across the country that are ready, willing, and able to handle travel. Yes, I'll take the nodding as a yes. That it makes sense.
Yes. Let me just, we will take a look at it. You know, keep in mind in particular that we have one of your Tampa sons is, maybe, assuming everything goes well up here, will be our undersecretary. I'm sure he will share your fervor and zeal in getting this resolved. So.
That's right, Mr. Chairman. A native son of Tampa has been nominated to serve as the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Frank Sanchez, and he's outstanding, and I look forward to an opportunity for you two to get together.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to the same opportunity.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
All right. The chair now will entertain, the chair will now, if our witnesses will continue to be with us, the chair will authorize a second round of questioning. We'll give each member an additional 3 minutes to ask a question. So in that regard, the chair recognizes himself for 3 minutes. Are either of you familiar with the report that was issued by the ranking member of the Committee on Foreign Relations, Senator Richard Lugar, the ranking Republican member? Are any of you familiar with that report?
I've read it.
You read it? Okay. And are you familiar with his comments or in conclusion of this report on page 11? And I'm going to read it just for a reference here. In hindsight, the U.S. embargo has not served a national security agenda since Cuba ceased to be an effective threat to the security of the United States. In the immediate post-Cold War era, the cost of maintaining this policy was negligible in comparison to the domestic political benefit derived from satisfying Cuban American groups in the U.S. The USG justified the embargo policy as an incentive or inducement for negotiation with the Cuban government, the rationale being that the U.S. would lift the embargo or parts of it in response to reform of human rights and democracy. This narrow approach, however, has not furthered progress in human rights or democracy in Cuba, and it has come at the expense of other direct and regional strategic U.S. interests. Today it is clear that a reform of our policy would serve security and economic interests in managing migration effectively and combating the illegal drug trade, among other interests. And it goes on and on and on. And I want to ask unanimous consent that Senator Lugar's report of February 23rd, 2009 be entered into the record without objection, so ordered. Do you have any response to the Lugar report, Mr. Borman? Have you had a chance to see it, and what are some of your commentary, your reactions to that report?
Well, I have read it. I have to say I don't have any commentary on it. I think this is something that the folks in the administration that are looking at Cuba policy writ large, I think would be looking at in conjunction with a variety of other inputs on the Cuba policy. But we at the Department of Commerce have not been specifically tasked to review that and come up with response.
The ITA administrator is an advocate for U.S. businesses all over the world. In your experience, what sort of protections and assurances do people expect from the U.S. government when operating overseas? And should American companies expect that same sort of support if and when they do business with Cuba?
Mr. Chairman, the International Trade Administration, particularly through our U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, where we've got a network of over 100 offices across the United States and about that same number, I think, overseas, abroad, provides a number of services for the information gathering, putting buyers and sellers together, finding agents and representatives for U.S. firms. These are all services which we would certainly have, would make available to U.S. companies, should the situation change, and keeping in mind that at the moment the embargo precludes us from doing anything with the U.S. business community in so far as Cuba is concerned. But we do have the ability to react and react quickly to changing situations, whether it is something that comes about as a change in an economic situation or political situation or a natural disaster, reacting to hurricane destruction, things of that nature. Yeah, we can do that pretty quickly.
The chair has run out of time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Radonovich, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got one question for either member of the panel regarding business in Cuba. There was testimony that will be given during this committee hearing that 500 international companies represented in Cuba, and many with substantial investment there. However, according to the State Department, the business environment is so unfriendly that the number of joint ventures dropped from 540 in 1982 to 287 in 2005. Because of the government's re-centralization efforts, it is estimated that one joint venture and 2 small cooperative production ventures have closed each week since the year 2000, and foreign direct investment dropped from $448 million in the year 2000 to 39 million in 2001 and to 0 in 2002. Are these 500 international companies independently owned, or are they joint ventures? If they are joint ventures, why the difference between the State Department figures and your testimony? Not your testimony, but the testimony that we've heard before the committee. Maybe you can comment on does the business climate work in Cuba for companies, international companies that are doing business there?
A lot of the information that we have is anecdotal, as I mentioned before, because we don't go out and collect information on Cuba, and we don't spend too terribly much time talking to our colleagues in other governments about their companies' experiences. We usually have other things we want to talk to them about.
Right.
But anecdotally, I think the answer is it's not the easiest place in the world to do business, and we are aware of whether they're joint ventures or direct investment, but everything's a joint venture of some sort, that have failed, or where the foreign partners certainly, what you got going in is not what you expected to find. So there's a lot of that. And again, not to beat that horse to death, but it goes back to the kinds of issues that you're interested in, and the non-tariff types of obstacles that exist. So.
Thank you, Mr. Bastian. Mr. Borman, any comment?
No, I have nothing to add to that.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Castor for 5 minutes, 3 minutes rather.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, the President Obama's announcement and the White House document that followed was very specific when it came to telecom companies. Any telecom company in this country, what should they be doing now to investigate economic opportunities?
We haven't had any reaction from the Cuban government yet on what's happening. I'll tell you quite honestly, if you had asked me this question Friday at 3 o'clock, I would have said no company has called me on this yet. To give you an indication, at about 3:05 I did get my first phone call. And they weren't interested in the specific opportunity or condition of the market as they were what's just the general likelihood that this will happen at some point in time. And I think you'll probably find that there are a number of companies that probably already got some market research that they've collected through other sources, most of them outside the United States.
I've heard, I've been contacted as well, and just people want to understand the process.
That's absolutely right.
So it's right now we're waiting to see what the next step from the Cuban government is.
Correct.
Is that correct? And
Yes, ma'am.
there's no organized effort at Commerce. There might be, maybe our next panel would have some information on that, but as of right now, Commerce doesn't have a strategy, but telecom companies should stay tuned. And
Well, no, they can contact us in our part, because we can talk to them about what specific licensing requirements would be and how to coordinate that with Treasury. Because again, for us, if they are looking at opportunities that would involve the export of hardware or software or technology, that's what's covered by us. The financial arrangement part of it would be covered by Treasury. But that's what we can tell them about how we would deal with an application for some kind of transaction. As Mr. Bastian said, the other part is what the Cuban government will do, because somehow all the telecom providers will have to deal in some way with the Cuban government.
mm-hmm. That's helpful.
But
Thank you.
they should definitely contact us.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Dr. Gurry is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as we've heard in the testimony and some of the question in regard to opening up trade to Cuba more so than we currently have done, and that it would maybe increase human rights and be more effective than the embargo has been. And yet we've negotiated a trade agreement with Colombia, a country not too terribly far from Cuba, that is working very closely with us. I think it's a fair statement to say that President Uribe is a friend of the United States and has done an outstanding job in dealing with the FARC and trying to abide by every request that our Congress has made regarding labor relations, and I think they've made great progress, and yet here we've been sitting on a trade agreement, bilateral trade agreement with Colombia for over 2 years. And it's not just about trade and the importance of having that bilateral relationship and open our markets to them and theirs to us, but it's a huge security issue. And why we would take our eye off that ball and all of a sudden focus it on Cuba, where we don't have a friend in the Castros, and the amount of trade we're talking about, I don't think compares to Colombia. I would love to hear both of your thoughts in regard to that. Why take our eye off the main issue in regard to dealing and ratifying that bilateral trade agreement with Colombia and focus on Cuba? Maybe we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but go ahead and comment on that. I appreciate it.
I think the issues are maybe at first blush they appear to be somewhat similar, but I don't think they are. I think there's a huge there are emotional issues and political issues and social issues when you come to deal with Cuba. That, in particular, I think on the emotional and political side, the issues are different than they are with Colombia. I do agree with you that President Uribe's made excellent strides in trying to get that agreement through and to try to accommodate the United States. I think it's clearly a discussion, though, that will be held between Uribe's administration, President himself, because he does get involved. By that I mean President Uribe, because he does personally get involved in these, and Ambassador Kirk at the U.S. Trade Representative's office to move this ahead.
Trade agreements are really in Mr. Bastian's bailiwick, so I have nothing to add to his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
The chair, thanks, the gentleman. The chair now want to again thank the witnesses for appearing before us today. You have, with your narrow perspective, and I do respect the fact that your perspective had to be narrow because it could not enter into policy areas which is not your purview and have not been clearly defined by the Obama administration as of yet. So I certainly appreciate your being with us to give us this narrow perspective as it relates to your jurisdictions. We want to, again, thank you so much for being a part of this subcommittee hearing, and we ask you now that the panel, the first panel is dismissed, and thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now calls the second panel to the desk.